Yo, what's up everyone? Welcome to Small World and thank you for joining me with today's video. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to create a super realistic Wild West themed model railroad diorama from scratch. This project was lots of fun to make. In this video, I'll show you how to make miniature old wooden signs with custom Waterslide decals, how to make western facades using foam core, basswood siding, and balsa wood strips, how to paint and weather buildings using acrylic paint and packing tape, how to paint old miniature windows and doors, how to make miniature shingles, and much more. Let's get started. I designed the buildings in CAD and I printed out the facades. A PDF for each building is available for download for all of my Gold and Platinum members on Patreon. If that's something that interests you, I'll leave a link in the description below. Anyways, the first building I started with is the general store. I begin by cutting out the printed elevation, and I cut out the windows and doors too using a sharp X-Acto blade. Then, the paper template is placed on some black foam core, and then the cutout design is traced with the pencil. The windows and doors are cut out again using a sharp X-Acto blade. Eighth-inch thick basswood trim is glued to the top of the facade to add some decoration. It looks a bit thick, but it'll look much better once the siding is glued onto it. For the siding, I'm using 1/4-inch clapboard basswood sheets that I bought off eBay. I believe they make similar sheets out of styrene too, if you'd prefer to use that instead. I start by cutting out pieces for my facade, and it takes multiple passes to cut all the way through. I continue cutting out pieces to make room for my windows and doors. The pieces are glued to the foam core using super glue, and I line up the next piece to work my way up the facade. After the next piece is cut, the windows are again marked with a pencil and cut with an X-Acto blade. Then, the next piece is glued in place. The bottom of each strip has a notch that allows it to overlap the previous sheet of clapboard for a seamless finish. I just repeat this step until the facade is covered. To add some texture, I quickly score the surface using a wire brush, and then I use the X-Acto blade to break and weather some planks. This helps give a more worn finish to the siding and helps add some variation to the surface. To add some depth to the wall, I glue on some foam core sides using hot glue. The new sides are covered with the exact same clapboard sheet. This is how it looks so far, and the gap at the bottom is for a deck that will be added later on. All of the wood is stained with an acrylic wash that is made from black acrylic paint with a little bit of brown, some isopropyl alcohol, and water. I just brush it on with a chip brush, being sure to get full coverage. This wash makes a nice base coat for old dried wood. Once dry, chipping fluid by Vallejo is brushed over the surface. I don't think this step is necessary, but it's a good failsafe in case the chipping technique I plan on using doesn't work. Ivory acrylic paint is brushed over the entire surface in a very thick layer, as the thick layer gives the best result for paint peeling in my opinion. Once the paint is freshly dried, I gently scrape the surface using a razor saw, which creates small tears in the paint. Then, I apply some packing tape and randomly peel up flakes of paint for a realistic finish. This step is repeated across the entire building. I work in sections because I don't want the paint to dry too long. The longer it adheres to the surface, the more difficult it is to remove. If you're finding you're having a hard time removing the paint, just wet the surface with water and scrape it away using the chipping fluid method. As I said earlier, it's a great failsafe, but I didn't have to use it for this project. I wanted the sign for the building to be painted directly onto the siding, so I applied a Waterslide decal directly onto the facade. This is just a clear, cheap decal film that I purchased on Amazon, and I printed them off on my home printer. I'll be making lots of signs for this project, and I'll go more in depth in the process later on. To weather the paintwork a little bit more, a diluted India ink wash was brushed on and then sanded once dry. This is a subtle way to bring out the surface texture of the wood. Now I'm painting the trim with a dark brown color. I want it to look as if the trim was painted brown, not as if the wood was stained brown, so I'm leaving some patches of the wood surface visible to make it look like the brown paint has slightly peeled. More strips of wood are painted, which will get glued onto the building soon. Windows and doors are pressed in place. I made all of the windows and doors at the same time, so I'll show you how I made them all later on in the video. But for now, I'll just show you the installation. The tolerances were really tight, but I added a couple drops of super glue from the backside to lock them in place. The brown painted trim was glued to the corners of the building using super glue. Wood trim is added around the window frame. I used a thinner 1/8 inch piece for the sides, and I used a larger 1/4 inch piece for the trim above and below the window. The doorknob is super glued in place along with some bare wood on the sides below the clapboard. Here's how the building looks so far. The large empty space between the first and second floors will be filled with a large porch roof later on. But now, you can see all of the detail of the peeled paint up close. Next up is the leather shop, and again, I started with the paper template, transferred the measurements, and cut out the design in the foam core with my X-Acto knife. Instead of using a clapboard siding, I wanted this facade to be made from wooden panels and a board and batten finish for the top half. I used super glue to adhere balsa wood sheets to the top of the facade. Once it dries, I flip it over and cut off the excess, and I continue to glue balsa wood across the top until it's covered. A strip of balsa wood is glued horizontally across below the large sheets above. Then, more balsa wood strips and panels are added to the bottom half of the facade. The left side of the building will be slightly visible, so I roughly add some balsa wood planks to the side. The excess material is trimmed away and then the sidewall is glued in place. The entire surface gets stained with the dark acrylic wash, and I cover everything up using the chip brush. I applied the chipping medium off camera, and now the entire surface is being painted with this nice mint green color that I custom mixed using a few craft acrylic paints. I apply the paint in a thick, heavy coat, and I make sure to brush the paint in the direction of the wood grain for each panel and strip. When the acrylic paint is freshly dried, I scrape the balsa wood lightly with a razor saw, and again I peel the paint with masking tape. I enhance the wood grain texture by applying a highly diluted ink wash over all of the green paint. The windows and doors are pressed into place. Then, some balsa wood trim is added and painted in a darker green color for a two-tone look. The battens are also painted in a darker green color, and then they're glued into place. The doorknob and sign are attached using super glue, and this is how it looks so far. Just like the general store, the leather shop will have a porch roof that will be added on later. The sheriff's office is next in line, and after cutting the basic shape from foam core, it gets laminated with the same basswood clapboard siding that was used on the general store. The top of this building has a more intricate shape, so I just glued the clapboard on, flipped it over, and then cut off the excess. The dark wash is brushed on, but this mix is slightly lighter than the previous two buildings. This facade will be painted a dark red, so a slightly lighter wood tone will contrast better for the peeling paint effect. Barn red acrylic paint is heavily brushed over the entire surface. The paint once again gets scraped with a razor saw and then peeled with masking tape. Rather than a darker ink wash, I decided to go with a buff wash in order to not darken the red too much. This will still weather the surface, but it'll look more dusty. Green picture windows and the door is pressed and glued into the right position, and white trim pieces are glued to the top of the facade. More 1/8 inch wide green trim pieces line the rest of the building and is held in place using super glue. The signs are glued towards the top of the facade and the doorknob is glued in place. Next up is the hotel, and like the general store, it's a larger 2-story building. This is the last building that will use clapboard siding that was previously used for the sheriff's office and the general store. Like before, I add depth by gluing foam core walls to the sides, and then I cover them using more clapboard sheets. I go back with the full strength dark wash since the paint color for the hotel will be a lighter blue, and a darker wood tone will contrast nicely with the peeled paint effect. I custom mix a slight blue color and I put on a heavy coat with a chip brush. Like before, I'm brushing in the direction of the wood grain. The freshly dried paint is quickly peeled with more masking tape and the entire surface is coated with a highly diluted ink wash. It looks like it's a bit much going on, but it dries to a much more subtle finish. White trim pieces are glued to the sides and then the windows and doors are pressed in place. I apply some white painted planks towards the top of the facade, which is where one of the signs will be glued on later on. The white painted pieces receive an ink wash as well. More basswood window trim is glued in place around each window frame with 2 1/8-inch wide pieces on the sides, a 3/16-inch piece on the bottom, and a larger decorative triangular piece on top. The sign is glued onto the whiteboards from earlier and then 3D printed decorative trim is added towards the top of the facade. Doorknobs are super glued in place and this is how it looks so far. I'll be adding a balcony and a railing later on in the video. Last but not least is the barber shop, and rather than using the clapboard siding this time, I just used some balsa wood strips for wooden planks. I just glued them in place one at a time until the facade was covered. The left side will be visible, so I covered that in planks as well. I'm staining the balsa wood with the dark acrylic wash, and instead of painting it with acrylic colors like the other buildings, I decided to leave this one with a bare wood finish. But there's a couple things we can do after the wash to make the surface look more interesting. Once the initial coat is dry, I go back and add a second coat of wash, but only to certain planks to add some variety to the surface. After the second coat dries, I sand the entire surface using 320 grit sandpaper. To me, this has the most significant impact in making the wood look old and worn. It's one of my favorite techniques to use when replicating old wood in a quick, efficient way. 2 windows, a door, and some decorative trim is glued into place, all of which are painted white. And here's the completed barbershop facade. Now I'm going to go back a couple of steps and show you how I made all of the signs using Waterslide decals. Again, I designed all of these graphics myself, and a PDF will be available for download for Gold and Platinum members on Patreon. I printed the files on some clear Waterslide decal paper that I bought off Amazon a while back. At first, I cut a piece of balsa wood the size of my sign, I stained it and painted it white with acrylic paint. It was weathered like all of the facades using a razor saw and masking tape. The graphic was cut from the decal paper, soaked in water for a minute, and slid onto the wood surface after applying some decal solution. Once in place, more decal solution was applied to help the decal conform to the rough wood grain texture. This step helps make the decal look more like hand-painted lettering rather than a printed graphic. To integrate the decal even more, I pick at the graphic with my X-Acto knife and I tear it to make it look like chipped paint. Off camera, I sealed it with Tester's Dull Coat and this is how it looks. For the rest of the signs, I followed the previous steps except that I applied all of the decals to one large sheet of basswood and I cut them out. This makes it much easier to apply the decals as your placement doesn't have to be as precise. After the decals had set a while, I cut out each using my X-Acto knife. The signs with the rounded corners get shaped a little bit with a needle file. After sanding, weathering, and sealing all of the signs with Dull Coat, this is how they turned out. I've never seen this technique used before for making hand-painted looking signs, so let me know what you think of this method in the comments. Now for all of the windows. I designed all of them in Fusion 360 and I printed them on my 3D printer. Once again, all of these files are available on my Patreon if you'd like to join and 3D print these for yourselves. In my last video, I asked if anyone knew a good way to prevent warping on thin 3D printed parts, and a few of you suggested clamping the pieces between 2 pieces of acrylic and post-curing them with UV light that way. and I'm happy to say that it worked perfectly, and I used that method for all of these windows, so thanks so much for sharing that. I base coat the windows and doors with a watered down brown color. This step can be a bit messy, but it doesn't really matter because there's going to be lots of layers added on top of this. Next, I use the same craft acrylic paint that I used to paint the facades for these windows. I brush the color and the direction that I want the wood grain to be, and the wood texture will actually be made using the paint itself, so be intentional with your brush strokes. I looked at reference images of old windows and took note of where the seams were, so I used that to inform which way I brushed the paint. Here's a second coat of white going on for this window. Once dry, I slightly sand the edges to reveal some of the brown base coat. Then, I scribe the seams of the window with my X-Acto blade. It's a subtle but nice detail in my opinion. Still using my X-Acto blade, I add more paint chipping just by picking at the paint, and I enhance and imitate wood grain by scraping the lines into the paint in the direction of my brush strokes. A diluted ink wash brings out all of the detail and really makes it look like an old weathered window. I went a bit too heavy with the wash, so a clean brush with a little water helps remove some of the excess ink. And here's how it looks. I repeat these steps for all of the other windows and doors. Here, I'm sanding the ink with an ultrafine sanding sponge instead of using the brush with the water like earlier. Both methods work. The only thing that changes in this method is a color depending on what building it's for. This is going to be a two-tone green door for the leather shop, so I masked off some areas and I'm painting the recessed panels with a dark green color. Then, several layers of the mint green color are added everywhere else. Again, I'm brushing the paint in the direction that I want the wood grain to go. The seams are once again scored with the X-Acto knife. Then, the door is slightly sanded and the wood grain is enhanced by scraping with the X-Acto again. The ink wash does all the heavy lifting and bringing out all of the texture that we just added. Here's a quick look into how I painted the rest of the windows using these techniques. For the glass, I'm using the same clear acetate sheet that I've used in previous projects, but this time I lightly sprayed it with some Tester's Dull Coat, which gives a more frosted, dusty appearance. Then, I take each window frame, apply some foam safe superglue to the back with a toothpick, and I stick each one down to the acetate sheet. In my last project, I used a spray adhesive to do what I'm doing with the superglue, and it worked great. However, those window frames were made using paper products like chipboard, and spray adhesive works really well on paper. I'm not too certain on how strong the bond is with resin and spray glue, so I just went with what I knew and used super glue. With all of the pieces glued to the acetate, I then started to cut each piece free using my X-Acto knife. Some of the windows are flat picture windows, but some are double hung windows. The double hung windows were printed in two parts like these two brown ones. Once the acetate is trimmed, I apply superglue to the top of the bottom piece. Then, the top half of the window is glued in place. These white ones are also double hung windows, so I glue them in the same way. After all of the windows are assembled, I paint 1/16 inch balsa wood in the same color as the windows to build the frame around them. I add superglue to the sides of one of the windows and I glue it down to the painted strip of balsa. Then I trim off the excess. Next, I flip it over and I do the same for the other side. Then, I glue the top of the window to the balsa wood strip. Lastly, the bottom piece is glued to a 1/16 by 3/8 inch strip, so a little wider than the 1/4 inch strip. This is how the final window looks, and I repeat these steps for the other windows and doors. Here are all of the finished windows and doors, and all of these steps actually took a long time to do, much longer than I expected. It took me about 3 days of painting, weathering, and assembling to create all of these windows and doors, but in the end, I'm happy with the way that they turned out. I made a simple base that's roughly 2 by 3 feet, and I coat it with the cheap brown acrylic paint. After that, each facade gets glued into place using hot glue. Some buildings stick out further than others to create some variety and interest to the final look. Some basswood and balsa wood strips are glued out front of each building for constructing the decks. Again, some wooden decks are built taller and some are more recessed for the same reason of creating variety within the piece. After all of the pieces are glued in place, they're then stained with the acrylic wash. Dirt is added under each deck in case the ground is visible between the planks. Honestly, I probably could have skipped this step, but I did it just on the off chance you could see the brown paint underneath the decks. The dirt gets soaked with isopropyl alcohol, which breaks the surface tension. Then, watered down matte Mod Podge is applied all over the dirt, which will dry and lock everything in place. Balsa wood planks are added to the top of the decks, and I just glue them in place using super glue. I used planks that are both 3/8 of an inch and 1/4 inch wide, as I saw some references using different size planks for the decks. All of the wood planks are then stained with the dark acrylic wash. Like the barber shop, I sand all of the wood planks once the wash dries, and again, this helps enhance the old wood faded look. This is how the decks look after sanding. I start making roofs for the porches by constructing the frame. I cut some angled rafters by lining them up with the side elevations of the facades that I printed out. I cut the angle and the notch that will fit around the beam. I line the beam up with the front elevation drawing, and I mark where the rafters are going to be placed using a pencil. I line up the marks that I made with a 1-2-3 block to keep things square, and I glue the notched rafters to the beam one at a time using super glue. This is how it looks so far. Next, 1/8 inch wide basswood strips are glued across the rafters. Then, everything gets stained with a brown acrylic wash. I glue a 1/4 inch post to the porch and I line it up with a 1-2-3 block. The beam of the porch roof is glued to the post and the rafters are glued to the facade. Then, the other post is glued in place. The frame for the leather shop is glued to the facade and then the posts are quickly glued under it. Lastly, the same is done for the sheriff's office. For the hotel's balcony, I quickly construct a simple basswood frame and stain it. Wood planks are added and painted in the same manner as the decks. I glue the balcony in line with the door on the second floor and I add some larger basswood posts underneath. For the railing, I designed and printed several balusters and I painted them using the same techniques as the windows. I glued them one by one to a balsa wood strip and then added another strip on top. The railings get glued to the posts and then connected at the corners. Then, the railing is glued in place on the balcony. I stain the backside of a balsa wood sheet using a lighter brown wash. These are going to be the underside of shingles that I'm applying to the porch roofs. I'm staining the underside now because I won't be able to easily paint them once they're glued in place, but I'll be staining the top side after they're glued in place. This will make sense later on. I've made balsa wood shingles countless times for the channel and my method is still the same. After cutting hundreds of individual shingles, each one gets glued in place to the porch roof frame. This step is super time consuming, but I personally think it's worth the time. I haven't found any prefabricated sheet that looks any better. I glue shingles to both the general store and leather shop porch roofs. Then I apply some basswood trim above the shingles. Chipboard gets glued to the backs of the general store and the hotel, and some rafters are glued to the sides of each of the buildings. Then, more shingles are glued in place. The tops of all the shingles are stained with a dark wash. The reason why the underside was stained a more vibrant brown color was because references show that wood not directly exposed to the elements, like sunlight for instance, retain a more vivid color, while the tops of the shingles are faded and grayed out after years of exposure. After the washes dried, I again sanded the shingles with 320 grit sandpaper to bring out the old faded worn look. Here, you can see the leather shop shingles before sanding and the general store shingles after sanding. I think it makes a big difference. 45-degree angle braces are added at the posts and the beams, which is commonly seen on these Old West structures. For the model railroad element, I purchased some old G-scale track, but it looks a bit fake to me. I decided to prefabricate my own railroad ties from 3/8" balsa wood strips. I texture them with a wire brush, and then I cut them into lengths of 3.5 inches. Once I had all of my pieces cut, I glued each railroad tie in place about 5/8 of an inch apart from one another. Then, each railroad tie gets stained with the dark wash and then sanded like the previous old wood finishes. I removed the rails from the G-scale track and I primed them with a rusty looking red primer. I polished the paint off of the tops of the rails using steel wool to reveal the bare metal finish. Then, I glued the rails onto the railroad ties along the length of the diorama base. Then, 3D printed brackets painted the same rusty color were glued to the track with 4 brackets per railroad tie. Here's how everything looks with the facades and the track glued in place. I ended up filling the gaps between the ties slightly with 3/16" thick foam core to save some material when applying the dirt and ballast later on. I made a little balsa wood hitching post and I glued that in place outside the leather shop. For the dirt, I decided to use real dirt that I collected from the local desert. I brushed on a thin layer of matte Mod Podge and I started to sprinkle the dirt all over the base. I tried to keep the application relatively even, but I wasn't worried about being too precise. I made a lighter shade of dirt by adding some tile grout to the mix, and I focused the lighter areas directly outside of the storefronts, as those would receive the most traffic. I let it blend into the darker shade the closer it got to the track. The ballast was collected from the same place that I got the dirt, and I just sprinkled the rocks onto the track and then I brushed them into place. Some of the rocks are a little bit large, and I picked most of them out, but a few large rocks here and there didn't bother me. I locked everything in place, again soaking it with lots of isopropyl alcohol and then following up with some diluted matte Mod Podge. You can also use a misting spray bottle for this step too, but I find I have more control with the dropper bottles. It looks super messy at this stage, but everything will look great once it dries. While the dirt was still wet, I added a couple of wooden pieces for steps out front of the general store and the hotel. Here's how the dirt looks in place. It's still wet at the moment, so it'll dry a bit lighter. In the meantime, I'm painting some rust tones on some corrugated iron that I made from aluminum foil. These are just some enamel rust washes from AK Interactive, and I stipple them on with a sponge and a brush to get the texture. For a more in-depth explanation, I have a tutorial on my channel for rusty corrugated metal. I glued the corrugated pieces onto the porch roof frame of the sheriff's office. It would have looked good with shingles too, but I thought the rusty metal would be a nice contrast from everything else. I'm super happy with the way they turned out. I went to my paint booth and I base coat some 3D printed barrels a buff color. I downloaded this barrel file from Thingiverse. While I had some buff in my airbrush, I diluted the paint much more and gave a dusty layer to my Bachmann's Team Locomotive that I got off eBay. I'll be honest, I'm not much of a train guy, but this locomotive looked to be roughly accurate for the period. I was finding it nearly impossible to find a Wild West period locomotive in G-scale, but I'm happy with the way this one looks. I stained the barrels with some more of that dark acrylic wash which helps bring out the details, and then they were dry brushed with a buff and deck tan color to achieve a more faded look. After that, tape was placed around the bands and I brushed on some more of that AK Interactive streaking rust wash. This was super easy to do, and this is how the barrels turned out. I made a couple of basswood benches and then I glued some posts to the back of some of the signs that I plan on hanging. I 3D printed an axe and a hatchet that I made for my old cabin diorama, and I glued the hatchet to one of the barrels. I have a couple rocking chairs that I designed for my winter log cabin diorama, but I never used them, so I thought I'd use them here. I glued the barrel with the hatchet by the leather shop, I put the rocking chairs out front of the hotel, and I added some benches in front of the barber shop and the sheriff's office. I glued the hanging signs in place, and I added some more barrels out front of the general store. And with that, the model is complete. I'm actually really happy with the way this project turned out. I planned on making a train depot for the locomotive to stop by, but unfortunately I ran out of space on the model base. I just figured that the train depot is further back. Anyways, I took the model outside to the desert and I got these shots of the final result. I've had lots of fun taking these photos and I love the way that the mountains look in the background. I'd love to know what you think, so please let me know in the comments below. I want to give a big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. Your contributions directly help me fund these projects, and I'm super grateful for all of your support, and I wouldn't be able to do this without you. If you'd like to join them and support me on Patreon, I'll have a link in the description below. Depending on what tier you select, you'll have access to behind the scenes pictures of whatever project I'm working on before I post on any other platform. Also, all of the PDFs for the designs and the signs for these buildings, as well as the 3D printed STL files for this project along with all of my other projects, are available for download on Patreon for you to use in your own projects. If that interests you, I hope to see you there. Also, check out this fly that found its way to my model in the middle of the desert and he stopped by to say hi. In this scale, he's probably about the same size as a small squirrel. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.